Welcome to the Meaning Code. I usually have a guest with me when I'm on the Meaning Code, but today I wanted to talk through with you something that came up on an episode that I filmed with Griz. And he had this really intriguing idea that there is some connection between sacrifice and the collapse of the wave function. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and I wanted to talk with you about my thoughts. And so I have some handy dandy notes here. I might be looking down once in a while to look at the notes. So first of all, we have to think about the wave function. What does that mean? And what is sacrifice? So I know you've heard a lot of people talk about quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and we are all just babes in the woods over here because I'm not a physicist. I have talked to a number of physicists about it. But I only have a very vague idea of how the whole thing works. But I do understand one thing, and that is that from the standpoint of quantum mechanics, there is this wave that is just basically a wave of probabilities. I like to think of it as a wave of potential, but I'm not exactly sure that that's the way they always think about it, but it's a wave of probabilities. So a particle might be over here, or it might be over here, or it might be somewhere in between, or it might be in both places. But there are a number of places that particle could be, and one doesn't know where the particle is until one observes. And then when you observe this wave function, that particle appears someplace. So the particle, they sometimes use the word concretize. The particle concretizes into a thing instead of a wave of probabilities. And when you think about sacrifice, you can think about it in many ways, but just as a very practical standpoint, I'm going to think about it from the standpoint of the way Jordan Peterson talks about standing at this moment in time. I'm looking out at a field of potential, and that field of potential in front of me is combinatorially explosive, because there are any number of things I could be looking at. I could be looking at how many blades of grass I'm seeing. I could be looking at the shades of color that gradate from soft blue to dark blue in the sky, and how many clouds there are, or how many leaves there are on a tree. I could be looking at all of the possibilities that there are for my future, all the possible future jobs that I could do. I could be thinking about all of the failures of the past and how they're going to affect my path forward. Any number of things I could be thinking about. So I can become completely immobilized at every moment in time by this combinatorially explosive nature of what's in front of me at that moment. That's the field of potential. That's the wave function, so to speak. So here's another way to think about it. I have a friend who told me one time that she had gone for a anniversary dinner with her husband, and they're sitting in this really nice restaurant. And after a while, he's kind of staring off into space. And she just sort of let that go on for a while and continued to eat. But finally she said, "Stephen, what are you looking at? What do you think? Stephen, what are you thinking about?" And he said, "Well, do you realize that there's 42 boards that are going vertically, and then on the edge there are 37 boards that are going horizontally. And so if you calculate," and so he's off in this calculation of how many boards there are in the ceiling. Well, that is the combinatorially explosive nature of everything that's around us. So how do you make your way forward in this field of potential? And Jordan Peterson always says you have to fix your gaze on the highest possible good of which you can conceive. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we move along here. Keep that in mind, okay? So sacrifice is making a choice at each moment in time whatever forward movement that I make is going to make all the other possibilities disappear, because whatever choice I make, that is, we call it opportunity cost in economics. Any choice that I make means that there are a number of other choices that I can't make. So another way that shows up in economics is in the price mechanism. Price mechanism is one of the reasons that free market economies are so much more efficient and effective than other kinds of economies, is that we have a price mechanism that's based on the distributed cognition of all the people who buy and sell, and all the people who need things, everybody who's consuming anything. I have some idea of what matters to me and how much I'm willing to pay in order to get that thing that I need. And the person who is making it has some idea of how much it costs them to make it and what price they need to get for that thing. And so when the two of us can agree, then we've come upon a price. That price isn't something that can be imposed from the outside. It has to be determined by the multiplicity of people on the inside of this distributed cognition. All the various people making their own individual decisions about price, then the market is guided by that price mechanism. So in the Soviet Union, one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell apart was that they didn't have a price mechanism. They were trying to establish the price from the top down. And what had happened then is that there were long lines of people waiting to get a loaf of bread because there wasn't enough bread being made, but they had factories full of nails that nobody needed, because the factory manager was told, produce nails. So he produced nails. He had no idea that there was no market for nails. So he just kept producing nails. So all the resources go into producing the wrong thing while all the people are needing something else. So a price mechanism is very, very important aspect of opportunity cost, because you have a value judgment about what is important to you. And so you make a decision based on that value judgment, and it sets up a price mechanism, which is a kind of collective intelligence, you could say, within the society. Now, John Vervaeke talks a lot about relevance realization. And because I tend to think of the way things scale both up and down, when I started thinking about how, this sounds really weird, but how would relevance realization work out if you're thinking at the cellular level? You know, I've been having these discussions about the work of Michael Levin, who does this work with multicellular organisms, and how the cells work together, how they communicate via bioelectric signaling, and then they work together to accomplish the tasks that they need to accomplish, like where to put what in the body and how to build, building an arm or building an eye or something like that. So I want to talk a little bit about Michael Levin and his idea of collective intelligence. So I'm going to show you a film clip here. And we'll hear him talking about, so this is a very interesting video that he did for his university. This is the wrong one. I actually have a different one I want to show you for him. This particular one is a really cool one that he did for his university. Well, maybe this is it. Well, we'll try this anyway. Let's see where we're at here. Well, this is another point that I wanted to make. So let's move on to this one here.
A system that we know there's a collection.
Here he's talking about what makes something a thing.
What's the software? Okay. So how do the groups of cells know what to make and when to stop? As workers in regenerative medicine, if something is missing, we'd like to know how to convince these cells to rebuild. And as engineers, we actually also want to go further and say, well, what else can we build? Instead of this, with the same genome, what are these cells willing to build if we were to communicate with them? So I've shown you that the collective intelligence of groups of cells has anatomical goals. And the question, one of the questions you might ask about that is, how do they know what those goals are? How does the system, how does a collective intelligence represent its goals? How does it keep track of its goals? And in order to answer this in my lab, we took some inspiration from the brain, because that's, of course, a basic system that we know there's a collection of cells inside each of us that's able to carry out all kinds of goals. And so that's our inspiration. The way it works in the brain.
Okay, so you get the idea of the collective intelligence. I'm going to move back just a little bit and start this section at this level of patterns.
The working out of intelligence in two different spaces, okay, in the space of anatomical structure versus the space of behavior or other things that we normally associate with intelligence. And so let's ask that question: how do tissues know what size and shape to be? So,
okay, when he was talking there about in two different spaces, he's talking about problem spaces, because basically he defines intelligence as the ability to accomplish something in different problem spaces. So you might call that the frame problem. You might think about problem spaces in a number of ways, but he's going to go on to talk about one of the problem spaces is how tissues know what size and shape to be and how they know what pattern to make.
This is this is a cross section through a human torso. So look at this incredible order. All the tissues, the organs, everything is in exactly the right place, the right size, the shape, organization next to each other. Just amazing. Where does it come from? Because we all start life like this. These are all embryonic blastomeres that have to work together to build this exact thing every single time. Where is this pattern specified? Now, you may be tempted to say DNA. And the important thing about that is that we can read genomes now, and we know that when you read DNA, you read the genome, you don't see anything about the shape or size or symmetry or structure of the final organism. What you see is a description of the cell level molecular hardware. You see all the little proteins that every cell gets to have. But you still have this amazing question of, now having had that hardware, how is every cell going to communicate, cooperate, and compete with each other to make something like this? What's the software? Okay. So how do the groups of cells know what to make and when to stop? As workers in regenerative medicine, if something is missing, we'd like to know how to convince these cells to rebuild. And as engineers, we actually also want to go further and say, well, what else can we build? Instead of this, with the same genome, what are these cells willing to build if we were to communicate with them? So I've shown you that the collective intelligence of groups of cells has anatomical goals. And the question, one of the questions you might ask about that is, how do they know what those goals are? How does the system, how does a collective intelligence represent its goals? How does it keep?
Okay, that's the real question, isn't it? How does a collective intelligence represent its goals? It's true of a single intelligence, and it's true of a collective intelligence. How does it keep track of its goals? How does it represent its goals? And part of the problem comes down to you have to have goals in order to accomplish anything. And the goals have to be based on some sort of a price mechanism or on some sort of a value system. You can't have a price mechanism without having some way of valuing your time, valuing your resource, valuing your ability to trade with other people. There has to be some sort of a value system. And there has to be some sort of a value system for goals to be accomplished. I mean, if you imagine at the very smallest level, he's talking about these cells working together. And one of the examples that he often uses is a planaria, that when a planaria is damaged, if it gets cut in half, the half that is left will rebuild itself. So if the head is left, it will rebuild another tail. But if only the tail is left, even the tail has enough memory and information and programming. He wouldn't say that, but anyway, has enough of that in it so that it can rebuild the head. So you'll end up again with a perfect planaria, perfect every time. That's because somehow those cells have within them some organizational pattern or some ability to navigate an organizational pattern in order to recreate what was there before. And there has to be some memory of what was there before, or some pattern that's inside that can be acted upon. But then if you also think about it as an engineering problem or a construction problem, every single one of those little cells has to know what its task is and when, in what order these tasks are done, so the cells aren't just all running into each other all the time, because every cell has to go to a particular place and be a particular thing in order for the planaria to be reconstructed. So what is it that does the ordering of those things? I've listened to countless hours of Michael Levin, and although he will say things like they signal each other with a bioelectric signal, and then they go over and what he says is they just execute the subroutine. There's some sort of a subroutine that says, you need to rebuild that eye, or you need to put that leg over there. And the subroutine will just execute because it's what has all the information in it about how to build a leg. And it's what has all the information in it about how to build an eye. Now, he says the DNA only has in it the information about how to build the proteins that make the machines that do all the rest of this work. So you have your machines, but then the machines have to have some kind of code. I prefer to think of it as a rule or as a pattern or as an instruction. I had a conversation earlier this week, not for public consumption, with my friend Glenn, the physicist. We were just throwing around a bunch of ideas. And as we were talking, I asked him to explain again to me his idea about computational systems. Because when he thinks about the universe being computational, he's not thinking of it being a computer, but he's thinking about it having a certain pattern or a certain way of being. And he described it in terms of music. So he said, imagine that the musician kind of represents the computational system. And the musician has a rule set. The musician is like a state system. And the musician has the rule set. And the musician has the capability of turning the symbol on the paper into a physical action. And that physical action results in the sound of music. So the musician can turn the program into sound. The state of the computer is the fingering of the moment. At any given moment in time, the fingers are in a certain conformation. They're at a certain strength on the key, producing a certain kind of a sound. And the musician processes the symbols in order based on the rules. The rules are written right into the composition. And the musician plays to the end and then stops, and then now we're in an ending state. So if you have a symphony, you have many different musicians playing many different compositions. And yet when all those compositions come together, you get this beautiful sound, but it's coming together where things are woven together because each one is working from a piece of music that was originally intended for it all to go together. And each one is working from their own portion of that piece of music, executing their own part of the program. And at the end, when they all come together, this is what Jordan Peterson calls meaning. This is when meaning arrives, is when everything fits together like that. And then you're listening to it and you can feel the meaning of the moment. Now I got to thinking, why is that meaning? Because he also talks about meaning arising out of doing hard things, being the one at the funeral who is capable of bearing the load for everybody else, being the person who goes out and builds something being the person who sacrifices on behalf of others in order to provide, like the man who sacrifices his time and energy to provide for his children, or the soldier who sacrifices his life for his colleagues. Meaning comes from that. So why does meaning also arise when all these pieces of music fit together? And I started thinking about meaning in many ways can be distributed out like that distributed cognition thing, where in order for the composer to produce that piece of music, the composer went through sacrifices moment by moment, sacrificing one choice for another, sacrificing all the other possible notes for that one note that goes in that one place, choosing that one particular time, that one particular rhythm for all the other rhythms that could be there, that one particular length of note for any other length of notes that could be there. Each of those is a sacrifice of all the other potential for that one thing in that one moment. And this agglomeration of all these little sacrifices, along with the sacrifice of his time and energy and soul and spirit, and maybe the painful memories that he had to surface in order to bring this beautiful piece of music out of himself. All of those sacrifices put together get made into this piece of music, and then the piece of music comes out to other people who are able to execute the subroutine and recreate this piece of beauty and bring it into the world. That's computation. That's the kind of computation that the universe is made of. So I'm thinking about that, and you know, I'm also always thinking about Stephen Wolfram, and I want to share with you a clip from Stephen Wolfram's work. He's doing this really interesting thing. Now, there's no visual here, so don't worry that you're looking at a blank screen. You're going to hear the audio. He's always working with scientists from different arenas. Like here, he's working with people that are in molecular computing. Sometimes he's talking to biologists, sometimes he's talking to chemists, and he's trying to see how his theory might relate to these other domains. And in this particular one, he's talking to this guy who knows something about molecular computing. And they are discussing one aspect of Wolfram's theory. You know, I've talked before about his theory that time and space are two separate things. Space is made up, not the way we think of it as an arena that we can move around in, but in his vision, space is made up of atoms of space, teeny tiny things, way tinier than quantum particles. But these atoms of space are all that there is. And so everything that is in the world, in his mind, is made up of these atoms of space and how they're connected. So it's all in the relationship amongst these various atoms of space. Well, he decided he didn't want to call them atoms anymore because there's a confusion there, obviously, with what scientists are already calling atoms. So instead, they started calling them Emes, like the word meme, but without an M in the front of it, Emes. So here they're talking about these Emes. These are basically you could think of them as the building blocks of the universe in Wolfram's theory. And here's what they say.
Okay, in the Roolead, the entangled limit of all possible computations, what is the raw material on which the Roolead operates? The raw material are Emes, E-M-E-S, which are atoms of existence. And in the case of space, those are instantiated, we can think of those as atoms of space. Mm-hmm. So the issue is, and I'm going to go, we get to actually use this again. Thank goodness for that. Hyper-Roolead. It has not seen a lot of use yet. Okay, so James's observation is that the proof of uniqueness of an of an atom of existence, cannot be made in the context of the Roolead alone, but requires regression to the hyper-Roolead. Okay, so
just for some context, right? So Emes have to, they possess two properties. So the first is that they exist, which is important, and the second is that they have UUIDs. Okay, they have to exist because if Emes don't exist, I mean, they're the primordial building blocks of the Roolead. So if the Emes don't exist, then the Roolead doesn't exist. But they also have to be unique, because if they're not unique, you can't distinguish between them. And I would say if you can't distinguish between the Emes, then there's no reason to say that there are multiple Emes, and then you basically have a big crunch in the Roolead, and the whole thing will collapse. So you have to have both of them.
You know,
go ahead.
Okay, so first point about the Roolead is one of the key issues is, the Roolead in its rawest state trees out everything. Okay, but there are equivalences which make the Roolead non-trivial. Okay, but those equivalences we have said are, those equivalences are being made by observers. I mean, most of the equivalencing is done at the observer level. Okay, but so now what you're saying is that if you want to know, I mean, the equivalencing of Emes and the fact that they are not all equivalent, you're saying is something that is outside of the observer. The non-equivalence of Emes, in other words, being able to tell there are Emes that the observer can equivalence.
Yes.
The claim would be that going the other way, that maintaining the Emes as inequivalent is something not within the power of the observer. That is, an observer can equivalent. The claim would be an observer can equivalence Emes,
but only because they're by default unique in the rule.
Okay, I've listened to this many times, and I just now had an insight that I think helps me to understand this better. So the basic idea is that up here he says Emes exist and they are unique. And this is super important, because if Emes are the building block of the universe, what they're saying is that every single one of these building blocks has to be a unique identity. And if that were not so, the universe would collapse. But that as observers inside this universe, as when he says observers, he means we are part of the system. And so we can only see things within the system because we are part of the system. So it is possible for us to do some equivalencing of looking at all these particles, these parts of the universe that are unique and particular, but it's possible for us to equivalence them in some way, to see them as being similar, so that we can make some judgments, so that we can do scientific studies, so that we can have advancements, so that we can learn new things and build things. And I think what he means when he says equivalencing, I think he's talking about categorizing, that it is possible for us to categorize, to put things into categories that help us make sense of them. Because if we couldn't put them into categories, then the world would just continually be computationally irreducible, combinatorially explosive. We would be completely immobilized at every moment. So this issue of the uniqueness of identity of each part of the universe, I think, is super important. And he sees it, but as they go on in the discussion, the final conclusion that they come to is that the only way these Emes can be maintained as being unique, because imagine it, I mean, there's, I don't know, 10 to the 500th or something, or maybe way more than that, Emes in the universe. And it would not be possible for any observer within the universe to hold all of those as being unique. That can only be done by something outside of the Rulliad. So that holding as uniqueness can only come, that giving unique user IDs to every single Em in the universe can only come outside in the hyper-Rulliad. And unfortunately, he goes on to say, well, then there must be a hyper-Rulliad above that and one above that. And so he gets into this infinite regression thing. But I think it is true that whatever it is that holds all of these Ems unique is outside of the Rulliad, or outside of our universe. And that's what gives uniqueness to each part of the universe. Okay, so here we are. I think I'm on the next page now. Here we are at the field of potential, where you have to decide not only what path you're going to pursue, you actually have to decide what it is that you're going to see within this field of potential. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to see the path that's out in front of you? How are you going to walk that path? Which direction are you going to go? So somehow you need to narrow that field. You need a frame. And Jordan Peterson reminds us that the frame is based on the highest possible good of which you can conceive. And if you do that, if you put your frame, if you make your frame the highest possible good of which you can conceive, then the best of all possible paths will open up for you through that field. Here's the key. The best of all possible paths does not mean that it's going to be the easiest. It does not mean that it's going to be the one that brings you the greatest wealth or the most comfortable life, but it is the path that is going to be best for you. And it is the path that upon which you will learn what you need in order to keep moving on the path. And the interesting thing that sounds as though it actually comes from the quantum physics world when Jordan Peterson is talking about this is that if you have your focus on the highest good, then somehow, some way in your peripheral vision out into this field of potential will arise things that you need in order to find the path and traverse the path. In much the same way that if you started searching for a car and you have a particular car in mind, my husband thinks he wants to get an electric car and he thinks he wants to get an electric Audi. Well, good luck. There are no electric cars available. And anyway, so all of a sudden we're seeing Audis everywhere. We never even noticed Audis before because where we live, everybody drives a Tesla. But now all of a sudden we see Audis every time we're out on the road, because into your field come the things that are, my mother used to call it something that arises in the apperception mass. So the things that, and I think John Vervaeke might talk about this in some sense regarding relevance realization. Things become relevant to you when you have a certain kind of a focus. So at each moment that you're facing this field of potential, you need to make a decision. Each choice sacrifices every other possible choice. And each thing that you do, each action that you take, each bit of potential that you bring into actuality sacrifices all of the other potential choices. There's always an opportunity cost. So this part I haven't thought through completely, so I may be way off base, but you guys can help me think it through. That when you build order out of chaos, entropy increases somewhere. I think that's the general idea, that the total amount of entropy in the universe is always increasing. So any place that entropy decreases actually has to or may not only generate as much entropy to replace the entropy that you have, the anti-entropy that you have created, but maybe a little bit extra, so that the total amount of entropy in the universe is always increasing. So in some way, entropy is the cost of creating order. The entropy that arises in the universe is the cost of creating order. So in one way, we might think of computational reducibility being the cost of trying to make our lives manageable. Maybe I got that backwards. The cost of trying to make our lives, the cost of creating order, trying to make our lives manageable, may actually be increasing the computational irreducibility somewhere else, because we're finding meaning in the part that's computationally reducible, but the amount of computational irreducibility is increasing elsewhere. So in my notes here, I have that there is a cost to our bodies. You know, our bodies start to disintegrate. There's a cost to our resources, even to our own opinions of our past selves. We have to give it all up in order to move towards the highest good. So science and math make their discoveries within the layer of computational reducibility. So we get these neat and tidy formulas and equations that have helped us build a world of technology that makes our lives easier, theoretically. I don't know, lately, if you've been to the supermarket and tried to go through one of those things where there's nobody helping you, but you have to run through the machine with all of your stuff, and you have to get the box in just the right place in order to get the thing to go bing so that you can hand it off to the next level. And it actually takes about 4 times as long to go to the supermarket now. But anyway, technology is supposed to make our lives easier. When we choose the ease provided by a particular technology, we are really just moving the ugly. I think you know what I mean. One of my friends once said he went down to help his brother get to move into a new place that they had just bought. And the ceiling in the hallway was really kind of smoky and dirty because the people that had lived there before had smoked. And the rest of the place looked pretty good. So they thought, we'll just paint that ceiling. So they painted that ceiling in the hallway, and all of a sudden you have this pristine ceiling. Every other wall in the house now looked dingy and dated and old. So they had to repaint the entire interior of the house. And then, of course, once you repaint the walls, then it makes the woodwork look dingy. So you have to repaint the woodwork. And once you've repainted the woodwork, now the floors just look terrible. So every time you produce a little order somewhere, all the disorder becomes way more obvious, right? And it's this same way that when we choose to find the easy way out by using technology, we are moving the ugly. I think Paul Vanderklay said it today in his discussion of sacrifice, which I highly recommend, by the way. When you talk about sacrifice, there are just too many things to talk about. So Jonathan Pajot has a really great video on sacrifice, and Paul has one too. And we probably could make videos about the nature of sacrifice from here till the end of time, and we wouldn't cover the subject. So anyway, we find an easier way out through technology, but we have offloaded the cost to somebody else, somebody somewhere. There's some little kid working in a cobalt mine or working in a lithium mine. Now, it may be a good thing that he has that job, because otherwise his family may starve to death. But on the other hand, we wouldn't put American children at risk in lithium mines and cobalt mines, but we're perfectly okay to feel morally superior by driving electric cars and using cell phones while other people's children have to do that kind of work. So sacrifice can get offloaded somewhere else and not be our own personal sacrifice. There's another kind of sacrifice that we don't realize what we're sacrificing. But if I think of One of my favorite things to do in the evening to relax after dinner is to scroll through Twitter for a little bit, because I have a lot of really nice friends on Twitter, pastors, thinkers. I get a lot of my ideas from of how to find guests from being on Twitter. But that time that I spend scrolling through Twitter is time that I'm not spending reading DC Schindler's book, Love and the Postmodern Predicament, or that I'm not spending reading Andrew Klavan's wonderful book, Truth and Beauty, or that I'm not spending preparing for a conversation that I'm going to be having where I'm buried in notes and haven't gotten things ready yet. So these little choices seem like such little choices, but they really have long-term consequences. The short story from that right there is that the frame matters. The frame of the observer matters. It matters what you're observing. It matters what you're focusing on. It matters how you're using your time. It matters what kinds of sacrifices that you are making. Are you making sacrifices that are beneficial, or are you making sacrifices that are actually damaging? So the kind of observer that causes that particle to be in one place rather than the infinity of other places it could have been, perhaps determines the quality or the nature of the placement of the particle. Let me go over that again. The frame of the observer matters. The nature of the observer matters. The goals of the observer matters. The values of the observer matters. The kind of observer that causes that particle to be in one place rather than the infinity of other places it could have been, perhaps determines the quality or the nature of the placement of the particle. That means that the way that reality comes into existence, or the way that things arise into the next moment, is determined by the quality and the nature and the values of the observer that executed the measurement that caused the wave function to concretize into a particle. The quality of the sacrifice determines the quality of the future. So, the collapse of the wave potential is the sacrifice of everything else that could have been for what is. Now imagine the beginning of the universe. Matter and energy and information coming into being. And if we are to believe quantum mechanics, coming into being at the beginning as pure potential. And all of these subsequent decisions or observations that brought that potentiality into actuality in all of the atoms and molecules and what I can't even read my handwriting here. Atoms and molecules and planets and solar systems and galaxies and eventually life. What kind of sacrifice brought that forth? What is the quality of sacrifice that brought forth that beautiful complexity, that extraordinarily undeserved abundance of beauty and grace? What kind of sacrifice was that? Perhaps love is the original observer. That's all I have for today.